I did have another question, Krystal, because we talk about kind of the dynamic on the show. Obviously, you're very similar to Zach and I's politics. You're kind of a progressive populist. Your politics were very similar to Bernie. We all three supported Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, obviously. Now we're entering, we already have entered, but now it really feels like we're entering a new era where our politics aren't represented by basically any of the candidates or politicians we're really talking about on a day-to-day basis. I'm sorry, but there's not going to be a Bernie Sanders or a Bernie Sanders-esque progressive that, steals the nomination away from Kamala Harris at the convention. All the people we're talking about are establishment Democrats. It's their party again. There no longer is this ascendant, burgeoning progressive movement that they're all in the shadow of, acting in this defensive, posture, pretending to be more progressive than they really are in order to, try to trick voters like us into thinking that they're just as lefty as Bernie, right? So it's a whole different dynamic. And, there's obviously been this whole phenomena, especially on Twitter, with the coconut pill memes and kind of this embrace of Kamala Harris, even from Bernie Sanders lefties. And a lot of it is ironic. Some of it kind of blurs the line between irony and an actual sincere case for Kamala. And I'm interested in your opinion on all of this because, friend of the show, David Griscom, tweeted out, a lot of y'all are embarrassing yourselves with this Kamala crap. She's overseen a genocide in Gaza, a cynical right-wing pivot on immigration, plus zero indication she will be supportive of important labor fights to come. Socialists should have more discipline. And well, obviously that's all true. Like, as I said, Kamala was one of the least favorite of our choices in the 2020 primary. None of us ever would have even dreamed or considered voting for her in the primary. I do think we kind of have to readjust to a different political landscape now. And as political commentators, I think it's important that, we don't just virtue signal, right? Like, no one wants to tune into analysis to just hear Zach and I say, we're actually to the left of all these people, and Kamala Harris is evil, and Mark Kelly is evil, and J.B. Pritzker is evil, and Andy Bashir is a neoliberal sellout piece of shit. Like, that's not really intellectually engaging, at least not for me as a commentator. So that doesn't mean I'm supportive of Kamala Harris's politics, but it does mean that, I can acknowledge the fact that I think she'd be better than Donald Trump, and I can talk about her electoral assets and liabilities in a good faith way without just making it about my own personal politics and my own personal political agenda. So how are you thinking about this kind of transition? And as a progressive commentator yourself, how do you balance that, not wanting to come off like a propagandist for the neoliberal Democratic establishment, but also not wanting to come off like a virtue signaling, crybaby whose progressive candidate lost 4 years ago and you can't get over
it. Yeah. I think there's two ways to look at it, just to zoom out. I think your basic analysis there, I'm in agreement with, but to zoom out a little bit, on the one hand, even Bernie Sanders isn't Bernie Sanders anymore, right? There's no candidate on the horizon where I'm like, oh, if we could just get that person in, then we'd have the socialist revolution that I've been dreaming of. That's just, maybe that person emerges, but I don't know who they'd be today, right? I don't see him out there waiting in the
We got to get a kid from St. Louis who was really moved about the Rams moving to Los Angeles, a small boy from St. Louis suburb that was moved to tears by his favorite football team. No, anyway.
Right. So I think that's depressing, right? That there isn't a sense of, oh, if we just, the next Bernie Sanders campaign is going to be the one that really gets us there. You could look at it in another way, though. Obviously, I can't just be like, well, other than Gaza, because that is, it's a genocide. It's horrifying. It's inexcusable. There is no way to look past that. There's no way to accept it. There's no way to downplay it. But on domestic policy, Biden truly was a break in some ways from the Obama era. He was genuinely better. And I don't think it's because Joe Biden has better innate politics. He is the most corporate, middle of the road. I mean, his entire record is just slavish devotion to corporate America. He was called the senator from MBNA because he was so closely tied to the credit card issuers in his home state of Delaware, right? I think the reason that you get Lena Khan and you get awesome NLRB is because, and you get, other things, focus on junk fees and the CHIPS Act and some industrial policy and those things, isn't because of anything to do with Joe Biden. In fact, it's in spite of who Joe Biden is. I think it's because we are genuinely shifting out of a neoliberal era towards something else. And so I suspect, even though Kamala Harris, her politics are wholly undefined, I don't think she has a lot of core principles. That's why her campaign failed in a lot of regards, as she was trying to change her campaign slogan with the seasons and never really knew who she was or what she stood for.
Medicare for all. Yeah.
As one example, exactly right. But I believe that Joe Biden's record reflects the fact that the era has shifted in a way that is going to impact all just sort of like normie run-of-the-mill Democrats in ways that we find to be generally positive. So in that way, there's like a sort of more hopeful story you can tell about where we are, even as we're back to the politics of just like, all right, well, who's better than, who's less bad than the other one, and let's parse the level of badness. Yeah. Right, exactly. I mean, that's the politics that we're in right now. And those differences, I do think, matter on the margin. So like, for example, when I'm thinking about the VP picks, I lived in Kentucky. I happen to know a lot about Andy Beshear, and I know he has a genuine commitment to labor. I think Roy Cooper is more of a sort of typical red state Democrat, very cautious, very business chamber of commerce friendly kind of a guy. And so I think it matters that you would have an Andy Beshear versus a Roy Cooper if we're thinking about what the future of the party is going to be. But my big picture sense of the era that we're in is in the same way that Jimmy Carter was a bridge from the New Deal era into the neoliberal era. I think we're kind of in that moment right now where Joe Biden starts to open up the door for a different type of economic policy. He himself is sort of a failure at it in the same way Jimmy Carter was a failure in many, many important respects. But I do think the old neoliberal era in a lot of ways is dead and dying and replaced with a question mark of what comes next. And that's where the important battles are going to be.
Yeah, so you are optimistic that some of the best aspects of Biden's domestic agenda, most importantly, labor and antitrust, you think there's actually a decent chance some of that could get carried over and translated into a Harris administration? Because I totally agree. Those are by far the best parts of Biden's administration, maybe the only good parts of Biden's administration. And it would be a shame if, a Kamala administration reverted to a Obama style of economics.
I'm somewhat hopeful on that. And she has one thing she's been fairly consistent on is she's been pretty good on labor. In California, union support is important. She did what she needed to do there. She's been in solidarity in terms of like, I'm not going to stay in a hotel. I'm not going to cross a picket line. Unions really like her, especially I was reading Jeff Stein's analysis. Apparently, like SEIU, service sector unions really like her. She's had a commitment to like the quote unquote care economy. So there are some reasons to be somewhat hopeful there. But if you also look into her record, especially when she was in California, you can find lots of reasons to be very pessimistic about what it's going to be. So I think most of the hope comes not from her record, but more from an aspiration that we've shifted into a new political era where this is just kind of like the normie Democrat stance. I'll tell you what I think about her on Gaza as well, which again, I'm not looking at this through rose-colored glasses. I'm not expecting her to like put on a watermelon t-shirt and be out there protesting genocide Joe, right? However, Bibi Netanyahu has made himself a very partisan figure. And I do think the just sort of normie Democrat reaction to Netanyahu in particular and the state of Israel in general has shifted. Biden is particularly ideologically committed to unconditional Israel support, self-identified Zionists. His view of Israel is stuck in roughly 1972 and whatever impression he had at that point in time. Kamala, I don't think is ideological in the same way, to the extent that Biden was willing to tank his whole freaking presidential run in order to support the genocide. I think if you had a Kamala Harris, I don't expect her to be principled, but even if she was just reasonably weighing,
concerned about her own hide,
pros and cons of this policy, I think she would end up in a better place. So that's why I am somewhat hopeful that on Gaza she may be better, not good, better than what Biden has been, because it'd be hard to be worse.